believe the U.S. presidential election
was ahead of the EU
interference
election.
said that
Now,
pro-Russian
Russia
information was promoted
Russia
by
could attempt to influence the 2024 election with propaganda posts. Nicole Skango.
Disinformation. We hear about it a lot in today's media. Scholars, academics, and journalists have all jumped on the disinformation bandwagon. If we believe what we are being told, it would seem that much of what we see and hear in the news and our social media consists of disinformation. But is it all what they say it is? What is it exactly? What are its origins? Should we even care about disinformation? If you want to know the answers to these questions, please join me in the propaganda universe. In recent years, disinformation, misinformation, and fake news have gained a lot of attention in the media and among scholars. To illustrate this point, you can see in this graph the number of publications on disinformation jumped from 43 in 2016 to 940 in 2023. That's an extraordinary 2,000% increase. So what accounts for this sudden increase in the attention given to disinformation? Did we just suddenly rediscover something that already existed? Or is this yet another new menace to society that has emerged from digital technology? One thing is for certain. The recent notoriety disinformation has gained occurred in the aftermath of the 2016 U.S. presidential election. Russia's interference in that election and in other Western democratic elections brought attention to Soviet-era propaganda and techniques such as active measures and disinformation. Scholars, journalists, and so-called experts described contemporary Russian propaganda using Soviet terminology. It would seem that what was old has become new again. A sudden fascination with disinformation created the perception that it was something new and novel. Being perceived as new and novel made it perfectly suited to describe some of the negative consequences of social media, which itself is still relatively new and novel. Moreover, the word disinformation does have a sinister ring to it, which has the effect of arousing our curiosity and take notice. Using a trendy word such as disinformation in a title draws attention to a scholarly work or attracts media audiences. Instead of using a long-established concept such as propaganda to describe manipulative communication, they use the more hip term disinformation. This is unfortunate because it creates the illusion that we are confronting a new menace, except that it is not. So let's look at a common way that scholars and journalists view disinformation. One of the most influential works on disinformation was published in 2017 by Wardle and Derrickson, titled Information Disorder. This report has been cited by over 3,000 other publications and is showcased at Harvard University's Shorenstein Center on Media, Politics, and Public Policy. Furthermore, the research conducted by the influential European Union's Disinformation Lab is based on the framework established by Wardle and Derrickson. The intent of the report was to define terms used to describe communication that contains false information and is intended to inflict some type of harm. As well, it offered a framework with which to examine what they refer to as information disorder. According to Wardle and Derrickson, Disinformation is defined as false information knowingly shared to cause harm. Misinformation they define as false information that is shared but no harm is meant. Aside from the notion of false information being the central aspect of disinformation, there are several issues with this definition. One has to do with associating the intent to cause harm with disinformation. Aside from failing to describe what they mean by their use of the term harm, disinformation can be shared by individuals who are not aware they are spreading disinformation but have no intent to harm. Think of the various conspiracy theories that people spread because they think it's interesting or amusing. According to Wardle and Derrickson, this would be classified as misinformation because the individuals might not have meant any harm. This despite being designed as disinformation by the originators. So you can see the problem here. The other issue with using harm to define disinformation is that it depends on one's perspective. For example, the Soviets' use of propaganda, which included disinformation, was the central effort in bringing communism to the world. Among the true believers, the goal was to improve the human condition and not harm it. In the Russian ethical system, what is deemed to be good is found in the ends as opposed to the means. This is opposite from Western-based ethical systems, which situates the good in the means used to attain a goal. So, in Russian ethics, as long as the ends are ethical, the use of any means are justified. Because the Soviets believed that the ends they were working towards benefited humanity, they were justified in using propaganda and disinformation. In other words, there was no harm intended. Obviously, the West had a different perspective and considered what the Soviets were doing was intended to inflict harm on its social, political, and economic systems. The overall point here is that using the notion of harm to define disinformation is highly subjective, as it is a matter of perspective and not a necessary condition that makes disinformation what it is. All that said, the major issue with Wardle and Derrickson is the weak basis on which their framework is built. A review of the references reveals the majority of sources were published within 3 or 4 years of this report. There were no references from the Soviet era on how they practiced disinformation. None of the sources were from a practitioner's perspective, and there were no references from authoritative propaganda sources. Nor did they access an existing definition from the English Dictionary of Record, the Oxford English Dictionary. The Oxford English Dictionary defines disinformation as the dissemination of deliberately false information, especially when supplied by a government or its agent to a foreign power or to the media with the intention of influencing the policies and opinions of those who receive it. Furthermore, the dictionary traces the etymology of the word to the Russian desinformatsiya, first recorded in 1954. This definition differs significantly than that of Wardle and Derrickson's. The omission of important sources on disinformation in their work suggests they started with an idea of what they wanted it to be and used source material that supported their concept and excluded evidence that was incompatible with their framework. In credible research, one starts with an idea or hypothesis and casts a wide net to gather relevant evidence to either prove or disprove the hypothesis. To exclude contrary evidence or fail to conduct a sufficient review of relevant literature is to call into question the credibility and trustworthiness of their research. Such as it is, it stands on a weak foundation. Consequently, research and scholarly work that is based on their framework likewise rests on shaky ground. Hey, if you find value in our discussion of disinformation so far, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share this video and others from Propaganda Universe, and please continue watching. Another example of the disinformation on disinformation is Bennett and Livingston's The Disinformation Age. To begin with, this work defines disinformation as intentional falsehoods or distortions, often spread as news, to advance political goals such as discrediting opponents, disrupting policy debates, influencing voters, inflaming existing social conflicts, or creating a general backdrop of confusion and informational paralysis. They elaborate on this definition by stating that disinformation involves the production and dissemination of intentionally distorted information for the purpose of deceiving an audience. One of the major problems with their conceptualization of disinformation is that it primarily is related to American political discourse. The authors themselves situate their work in the media, technology, and democracy area of studies, which has a very specific perspective through which they analyze their subjects. This perspective was largely formed by the work of scholars such as Edward Herman, Noam Chomsky, and Robert McChesney, among others. These scholars were focused on studying how communication is used to build and maintain government-corporate power relationships. Herman and Chomsky developed what they referred to as the propaganda model, which they use as a framework for the critical analysis of these power relationships, otherwise known as the political economy. Their propaganda model was not a study of propaganda per se, but was designed as an analytical tool. Bennett and Livingston's perspective is likewise politically oriented. They are not concerned with a study of disinformation in itself, but created a version of it to critique American political communication. Another major problem with this work is similar to that of information disorder, in that it engages a shallow pool of sources. Upon inspection of the sources, they are primarily contemporary works from a range of authors that have similar perspectives as Bennett and Livingston. In the chapter on disinformation in political and historical context, there were no sources from the Soviet era. And this begs the question, if one is writing about the historical context of disinformation, why did they exclude any reference from the Soviets who invented the concept in the first place? The historical origins of disinformation that Bennett and Livingston do provide appropriates the history of propaganda. What they describe as the early origins of disinformation is really the history of propaganda as political communication in the U.S. Their description of political propaganda is on point, but their narration transitions from propaganda to disinformation without signaling they are doing so. This comes across as somewhat of a sleight of hand, where they imply that the notion of disinformation originates from U.S. political propaganda and not where it actually occurred in the Soviet Union. In sum, their work suffers from the same issues as information disorder. Not only do both works rely on a shallow pool of sources, but they invent a concept of disinformation that suits their particular political point of view, that biases their work and calls into question the credibility of their scholarship. This is unfortunate because it negatively affects our ability to comprehend the true nature of disinformation and propaganda and complicates the development of solutions that enable us to deal with the challenges they pose. We should keep in mind that the distinction between propaganda and disinformation is significant. They should not be thought of or used interchangeably. Propaganda is a form of communication in the same way persuasion is. On the other hand, disinformation of the type we are concerned with is a technique that is applied in the larger context of a propaganda campaign. It does not occur in isolation, as it is connected to many other propaganda activities that together are designed to achieve a specific action or inaction. As the eminent propaganda scholar Jacques Ellul stated, propaganda is made, first of all, because of a will to action. Whoever handles this instrument can be concerned solely with effectiveness. This is the supreme law. Ineffective propaganda is no propaganda. To this end, Ellul writes that propaganda tries to surround man by all possible routes, utilizing any and all available instruments, each in relation to all the others, and composes a symphony. Disinformation is but one of these instruments that could be used when deemed appropriate. I say deemed appropriate because the use of disinformation is highly situational and is not categorically applied. It is important to note that Ellul views propaganda as being the overall construct wherein all the different tactics, techniques, and communication mediums are organized into a coherent force for effect. To understand the relationship between propaganda and disinformation, we can look to prominent historical examples. The major historical users of propaganda, such as the Soviets, Nazi Germany, Fascist Italy, Communist China, and now the Russian Federation, all view disinformation as an instrument in support of their larger propaganda enterprise. Importantly, all these actors not only use propaganda and disinformation domestically, but as a geopolitical tool. An indication of how they thought about the relationship between propaganda and disinformation can be found in the naming conventions used for organizations and officials responsible for these activities. For example, Goebbels was the Nazi minister of propaganda. The Soviet Union's propaganda organization was called the Department of Propaganda and Agitation, and Communist China still has its propaganda department. Note that none of these institutions or ministers were designated as disinformation entities. While they were certainly prolific users of disinformation, they were clear-minded with respect to developing effective operational concepts and optimizing their use because their driving imperative was to produce results. There is a certain amount of irony in that the literature that attempts to address the so-called information disorder itself causes conceptual confusion and disorder. Scholars, researchers, and journalists who help us to understand the world around us need to relook how they think about disinformation and propaganda. One of the most important things investigators must do is to avoid tainting their work with political valuations and perspectives, as well as moral judgments. Historically, this has clouded our understanding of manipulative communication. To this end, we should adopt a clinical attitude towards the study of propaganda and disinformation in the same way a scientist examines a specimen. We must also move outside the box of a U.S.-centric perspective and contemporary political communication to cast a broader net across national boundaries and time. Investigators need to access sources from practitioners who operate on the other side of the wizard's curtain. As Ellul tells us, to study propaganda, we must turn not to the psychologist, but to the propagandist. Finally, we should avoid thinking in terms of the hot topic du jour and seek to understand contemporary phenomena in a broader historical context. So, does all this really matter? Are we just arguing about semantics? Consider this. Our preoccupation with disinformation blinds us to the existence of a much larger propaganda campaign that aims to manipulate how we think and what we do. By overestimating the role of disinformation, we underestimate propaganda. To underestimate the power of propaganda is to put at risk our capacity to make choices that are in our individual and collective interests and not those of others. If you like this discussion on disinformation, be sure to join me in the next episode of Propaganda Universe, where I unveil the secrets of Soviet propaganda and disinformation. Podcast versions of Propaganda Universe's videos are available through most of the podcast directories, or you can visit either the Propaganda Universe Buzzsprout page through the links located in the video description. You can support the mission of Propaganda Universe by making a contribution through Patreon or PayPal. And as always, please remember to like, subscribe, and share this video. If you are interested in similar content, please consider checking out the podcast Cognitive Crucible, which features interviews with subject matter experts on various subjects related to propaganda and influence. A link to the Cognitive Crucible podcast is located in the video description. I hope to see you again for the next episode, and thank you so much for joining me in the Propaganda Universe.